So here we are again for another crack at what we're calling attempted intelligence. Now, the topic that I'm attempting to bring forth here is a little bit more obtuse, and it relates heavily to what I'm doing in my master's work. So I'm currently doing a master's degree in health science education. I am in a thesis stream, so I'm going to have to do original research. Now, because I'm focusing on health science education, and I am very interested in transfer and what affects transfer. So transfer being the ability to learn skill or knowledge in one situation and apply it to a dissimilar situation to varying degrees of dissimilarity or difference, right? So we have the idea that transfer, again, is you learn something in one space and you are expected to be able to do it or maybe show evidence of being able to do it in another situation. Now we have two kind of paradigms here. We have the more traditional paradigm of what's called direct application or sequestered problem solving. So very quickly what that means is that you learn something and then we change something about that or something about the context, something about the situation, either superficially or to a larger degree, and we see if you can perform the skill, knowledge, or ability in that slightly or very dissimilar situation. What we tend to find is that the further away we go from the setting where you learned it, the less evidence of transfer we find unless somebody's an expert. That can contrast with what we will call preparation for future learning. Preparation for future learning is essentially a paradigm that searches for improved speed or quality of learning in knowledge-rich environments. So the comparator here is that in the traditional setting, the direct application or sequestered problem-solving setting, you're expected to show transfer unaided, without help. Whereas in the preparation for future learning setting, you're expected to perform in a knowledge-rich environment. So how do you perform in that knowledge-rich environment? Now, all that said, I showed you something that presented some explanation. And when I asked you about it, some of it made sense, some of it didn't necessarily make sense, and I understand that for you as an individual, this isn't something that you're looking at. I'm looking at it. Right? So the reason I say it's somewhat obtuse is because there's a fair amount of information that if you don't have the background in it, it seems like it may not make sense, or that you don't have the information, and that's all fine.
I just said it was cognitively heavy.
Yeah. Well, and then there's cognitive alone. But whatever. That's not the point. The point is that my hope is to discuss the underlying concept of preparation for future learning and how we might leverage that. So with what you've seen and what I've talked about and what we talked about prior to filming the video, what are the key features in the concept of preparation for future learning as far as a way to identify transfer that you think you understand or that might be useful, right? So that's a loaded question. There's a lot of stuff.
So we're specifically looking at how to identify,
not necessarily how to identify. That's what it's doing.
Okay.
So in the way that preparation for future learning is being looked for, is being wielded in scientific research, they're trying to identify, trying to find ways to identify signs of improved speed or quality of learning in knowledge-rich environments. Okay. So because that's the central underlying concept, so I'll just reiterate, increased speed or quality of learning in knowledge-rich environments, not necessarily accurate replication.
Okay. So I'm just trying to understand the specific question is that you're asking me about the speed and quality of learning within preparation for future learning.
Within the knowledge-rich environment.
Within a knowledge-rich environment.
So within a knowledge-rich environment, how do you think that could be beneficial?
I just remember we were talking about earlier before the video, which was it's conducive into the environment that we're living in right now, which is there's a lot of knowledge and we're constantly surrounded and bombarded by information just in general. And if we're able to discover on our own and kind of process all of that information to a point where we attempt to do something and learn something, and there's still more knowledge coming in and still more experience coming in, I feel like it's going to be beneficial in the sense that if we're all doing that, so say you're learning with the information that's coming in,
Mhm.
I'm learning with the information that's coming in, and there's a communication that happens, an exchange of that information, understanding how you processed it, how I processed it, and still kind of failing, and still kind of,
Okay.
you know what I mean? And then having, and it keeps going down the line, but we're not always going to have access to an expert or professional or an instructor. And with that model of learning, you can kind of have that freedom to explore it, kind of do that on your own. But at the same time, you still do need that kind of guidance from the expert and
Okay.
the knowledge from above.
So one of the things that's been found by utilizing preparation for future learning as a paradigm to look for transfer is what they've done is they've had different experimental settings. But essentially what you have, the classic one, is you have everybody learns, actually no, that's incorrect. Basically the best way to put this is that what you're comparing is often somebody who's been allowed to explore on their own, right? So you give people a novel problem, right? So you give them a novel problem, and some people are allowed to explore on their own prior to hearing the explanation of how to solve the problem, and other people are just taught how to solve the problem, right? So the initial way in is some people are allowed to explore, try to solve the problem, usually don't.
And it's method.
The other ones are taught how to solve the problem. Then what you do is you put them in a situation where there's another novel problem, right? And the people who were allowed to explore prior seem to perform better. Doesn't mean that they solve the next novel problem. However, they seem to perform better, whereas the people who were taught a way to solve the problem, you give them the novel problem, and they seem to have a difficult time thinking that there's another way, right? So when you're talking about the ability to explore, the reason that I wanted to bring this up, and you pointed to the reality that we live in an environment that's information rich. Most of us have the opportunity to access huge amounts of knowledge anywhere that we are, that we can have some form of connection to the internet. So we have that ability. Then what we end up doing is needing to at least attempt to be careful with the information that we gain from our search. So we need to be able to vet that information, right? So the reason that I want to bring this up is that if you're taught that there's one way to do something and you're in an information-rich environment, what do you think, what could you predict might happen when you're looking to solve a novel problem?
Well, it seems like that old saying where I would rather, you teach someone how to do something and they can do that thing, or you teach them how to learn, or you teach them how to problem solve.
Sure.
So again, going into future problems and future things, you've now learned how to learn or how to problem solve, so you can go forward and do those things. If you're taught one way to do something and you're tossed into a completely new situation, it's one of those things where you solve, 2 + 2, but then you get thrown into a calculus class and you're like, I don't get it, right? But these formulas that you're learning, they get bigger and bigger and you're trying to process that. So if you can teach them how to learn those formulas, then they can learn new formulas in the future type of thing.
For yourself, with your personal experience, when in the past you were an apprentice mechanic, right? If somebody taught you how to do the job, the specific job, and then the same job comes in, but there's something different about it, what happened when that would occur?
I stopped.
You stopped because?
Because I didn't know how to work around that new thing, because the situation and the environment that I was taught in was very specific. So when that changed and there was either a missing part or something didn't come out, or it was just a different car. It looked different. The setups were different. I went, is it? And I would stop and I would say, is this the same? Do I do the same process? They go, actually, you got to go from top to bottom. This car's a little different, but overall, it's the same process.
So let's just say we look at being an auto mechanic, right? In a traditional sense, obviously now there's minor superficial differences, or some people call them major differences, with how we interface with the car, because cars have more electronic parts, right? But the problem-solving skills are no different, right? But the base skill set of working on a car, are they mechanical things?
Yeah.
Right? So how to appropriately use a wrench, right? Were you ever taught how to appropriately use a wrench?
After I discovered how not to use a wrench, yes.
But how did the learning happen? Did you ask somebody because they saw it, or did they see you struggling? What happened there?
For the most part, it was, it goes clockwise or counterclockwise, and then they would see me either struggle, break something, or just straight up fail, and say, what you want to do is this.
Okay, so it was essentially teaching that happened after you failed.
Yes.
Right. Was it beneficial at that point?
Yes, very much so.
This is hard to measure because it's personal experience, but would you say that once you kind of grasped the concept of how to use the tool, did that help you figure out what to do with other tools?
The specific tools that say had torque or rotation, when I encountered future tools with torque or rotation, I would immediately attempt to try to use it in that original way that I learned.
Okay.
But then understanding that tool is different, I would explore and understand, I don't need to ask. There's all these other things I can do. So I did learn a little faster with those.
So you failed, right? You failed, you got teaching, and then you learned how to explore. Right? So that seems to be experientially well mapped to the concept of preparation for future learning, or how it's been experimented with, right? The idea of failure in a lot of situations, creating a greater ability to explore and accept multiple solutions.
Right.
So when we search for something, if we believe there's one way to do something, right? If we believe there's one answer, and we're confronted with stuff that isn't necessarily mapping onto that, what's your experience in how you've found people interface with all that information? So there's an idea that I have, there's a belief that I have, I'm going to search for something. You're at work, people get in an argument and they pull out their phones and they go searching for something. Have you had the experience where they both do the same search, and they both pull up from that same search, on that same search engine, they pull up conflicting information?
Information that supports their side of the argument.
Okay, so do you think that they gain anything from that, or do you think they just are doubling down?
I feel like they're just doubling down on that. Like they're sitting there going, see, like I'm right. And it's like, oh no, you're wrong. But there's all this information. If both things exist on the internet, then you both should question whether or not you're right. You would
hope that would be the case. However, because they're showing the previous knowledge, the previous belief, they're doubling down on it. They can't see the other stuff, even though it's on the same search page. One person just went a little further down, or maybe they even both read the same article or the same internet hit, went to the same website. They took in the information and said, forget that. They literally ignored it because it didn't match their previously learned information. So the idea of preparation for future learning seems to be that if we allow you to explore and realize, so one of the things that seems to be hypothesized about failing, then being taught how to solve the problem that you failed at, allows you to compare and contrast your search pattern or your attempt with the expert.
Right.
You're able to compare them, and you are able to take either some explicit and some implicit lessons from that improve your ability to perform in another novel situation.
So it's almost as if when you fail first, you're adding to your knowledge. So your experienced knowledge, you learned something, you failed, you go, that part worked, that part didn't, or this part matches what the professional teaching me.
You can pull that out and talk about that. However, the lived experience seems to be, no matter what you do, you're learning implicitly.
Fair enough.
The question is, sometimes learning should be more explicit, it should be more clear, more well-defined. But one of the problems that we end up running into is that most learning is implicit, and implicit learning seems to be somewhat slow, right? And it's somewhat more, it's more difficult to change, right? So it makes you double down a little bit more sometimes in some situations. But the idea being, that at least implicitly you're able to compare your strategy to that of the expert. You can realize how far off you are. That's probably pretty explicit, like, wow, I was going the wrong direction. But it introduces you to the experience that you thought you were doing something right, and you got shown that you were off track.
Yeah.
Right? So you may be able to implicitly or explicitly learn how to course correct better.
So when you're not shown that you're off course, is that causing Kruger effect?
The Dunning-Kruger effect? I don't know that it would be causing it necessarily.
Right.
And just as a general refresher, if somebody hasn't watched that video or hasn't heard about the Dunning-Kruger effect, you map intelligence against self-efficacy. So how smart you actually are versus how wicked awesome you think you are at stuff. And what you see is people of observably lower intelligence seem to heavily overestimate their skills and abilities, where people of high intelligence underestimate their skills and abilities. So with what you were saying, if you're off course and you're doubling down, does that cause the ability to observe the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Right.
Maybe.
Okay.
I can't necessarily draw that relationship. It trips it in your head.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing about that is that you're trying to make connections. We don't have, currently, me and you in this situation, we don't have the information that could connect them.
Right.
I couldn't say that you're wrong, I couldn't say that you're right.
Right.
But yeah, I would say the idea that, I've been doing this for 20 years. Yeah, but you've been doing it for 20 years wrong, right? And you weren't able to identify that.
Right.
Then maybe, yes, sure, that's a way to identify the Dunning-Kruger effect. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's causative.
Yeah.
But the concept of being able to identify that you thought you were right, you were shown that you were off track, that actually seems to improve your ability to operate in another novel situation, because you may be more willing to question yourself and
I was
say,
going to say, accept the fact that I might not know.
I might not know. So this relates to a concept that I like to talk about, essentially operating with what I like to call the appropriate level of uncertainty. Right? My experience as a human is a constructivist experience. Right? So the truth for me is dependent on me.
Right.
However, there are some objectively observable things that are true for you and I and true for a cockroach.
Fair enough.
Right? But my experience of things,
Right.
so my experience of searching is a constructivist experience. I'm constructing my ability to search. So the skill that I could be gaining is to question myself and accept that from a constructivist epistemology or theory of knowledge, that there are multiple realities, there are multiple ways to do things. However, there might be something underlying it which is more positivist, which is, this is true no matter what, I just can't access it. Right? So preparation for future learning, to me, seems to be a way or a paradigm that would point to developing the skills and the abilities to be an expert novice.
Okay.
Right, so to go into a situation, novel, like
Right.
kind of new situation,
Right.
novice, new on activity, right? So to be good at being a novice, to be good at being put in a situation whereby you have the opportunity to bring in your expert skill, and your expert skill is to identify a novel problem. So you're in a novel situation, you can identify that. You can then identify how to maybe make a question, how do I solve this? What is this? How do I solve it? You can look for the information because we're in an information-rich time. Then you can vet those sources. Once you've vetted those sources, you can then wield the information. Right? So preparation for future learning seems to be a paradigm for me that underlies the ability to be an expert novice.
I feel like there's people like that exist in the world.
Of course.
I feel like we call them the naturals, the ones that they're natural at something.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, this is the first time ever doing it, and they're, oh, you're a natural.
Mm-hmm.
But it's their ability, whether they recognize it or not, to understand that there's connections and all of the things that they can use and process prior to, and apply that to the new situation.
Sure. What I would say is that most of the concepts that we have really are just names for observable phenomena. So the phenomena of the name of preparation for future learning as a paradigm that looks for improved speed or quality of learning in a novel situation, or rather a knowledge-rich situation, The novice, or sort of the natural rather, goes into a situation where they're given the knowledge to do the thing that they need to do, and they're able to draw on.
They're able to access.
So they're the expert novice. They're the expert at drawing on previous skills and applying them in that new situation. Right? So one of the things that's interesting is because we have so much information available to us, and we have to have the skills to vet that information and work through it. If we develop the skills to be that expert novice, we may be better able to do that, right? So maybe to deal with some of the conflict that people have when they both are in that argument, they both search for this, they both ask the same search engine the same question, and they come to different conclusions. Maybe it would be of use to explicitly identify, hey, you both know that you looked at the same thing and concluded different stuff, right? And that's fine. There's literally nothing wrong with that because that's going to happen. And as I say, human experience seems to fall better into the constructivist epistemology. So knowledge, truth is completely dependent on the observer, right? But objectively, they looked at the same thing, right? So to accept that there are multiple interpretations, there are multiple ways to solve the problem, or that there is maybe an observable central skill set to deal with novelty.
Okay.
Right. So what I'd like to suggest is that there may be an objectively identifiable central skill set. Right. It doesn't mean that everybody does it the same.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that everybody does the thing, or at least superficially that it would look the same. They're literally all running the same process. They're doing the same underlying thing, but it looks different.
All right.
Right.
I'm just trying to imagine like an example for a skill set like that. Just because I'm imagining, the two people looking up a search engine, and I feel like the skill would be to research and process information, but they're going to research and process information differently.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So like that, it seems like if we could pinpoint all of these skill sets in which people can use to access the knowledge and access all of these different things, then we can teach those skills.
Yes. So you want to, and I think a lot of that work's been done. Right. There are general problem-solving strategies, right, that are essentially meta enough, big enough that they can guide it. So the reason I say identify that you're in a novel situation, right? There might be all kinds of details you can fill in there. Once you identify or create a useful question. When you ask the question, you find the information, right? Yeah. You vet the information. Because there's going to be a reliability problem. The information may say different things, but all of the pieces of information that you find may say something similar. So you identify what's similar because that might be the underlying thing, the deep structure that applies in all of these situations, and then the ability to wield it. Right? So that could be a description of the phenomena of what could happen in preparation for future learning paradigm. It doesn't mean that it is. It doesn't mean that there's no other way to describe it, but that's kind of a way. And there's probably other meta search strategies, right? I mean, shoot, you could probably get a bunch of it from machine learning, right? Good search strategies. And then once you've searched, what do you do? So first of all, identify that you need to search. When you do the search, once you search, what do you do? When you figure out what you do, can you actually apply it? Right. So you can kind of come up with different ways to say that. So problem identification, search, learning, application. Right. There's different ways to describe this, but it all points to the same stuff. The useful thing is to at least have this discussion as a starting point to say, hey, we live in this situation where we can access a bunch of information, and we can't be expected without aid to answer questions or to take something that we learned in one place and apply it somewhere else without aid. Right? You need some cue. Now that cue could be a lot of different things, but the older idea that has the underlying assumption that if I teach it to you one place, you should be able to do it somewhere else. That's just it. That's how it goes, right? Observably, you need some cues, right? So this conversation could be a beginning for some people to be the cue. Look for what's the same. in certain situations when you're looking for information. Purposefully read a bunch of different stuff. So one of the things that I do is anything that resonates with me, if I'm looking up a new piece of information, if it resonates with me, I'm more worried.
Oh.
Because it's already affirming what I believed before.
Okay.
So it can blind me
Right.
to stuff that could also be true and counterintuitive. So if I search for something and I like the answer I find, I get more worried.
Okay.
I'm like, oh, that's pulling on your dumb string.
Right.
That's pulling on the string for me as an individual that would make me more blind. I'd rather find the thing that bugs me, right? Or find the thing that I like and the thing that bugs me.
At least, yeah.
Because then I can query those things and say, what's the same? Right? Because there might be something that's the same, it's just the interpretation on top. It's the window dressing that's different. Right? So there's a lot there. The conversation that we're having, again, is somewhat meta, it's somewhat big, right? Is there anything so far that you could pull from this that you think you could use?
Well, it seems like we were talking about the skill set earlier, and as you kind of carried on, I realized that's just like you said, just one chunk out of all these aspects and these elements that we can use. And I feel like the more important thing to teach is the recognition of cues. Okay. So like, even as you're sitting there and you're doing a search and you go, I recognize that this makes me feel better, it affirms my current knowledge of what I'm learning, and to recognize that as a cue. So like, I feel like as a society, as we're going in and we're trying to learn things, we're doing it the old school way. We're doing it that direct way where we're going, I want to know how to do this. I want to know exactly what the answer is. They get an answer, go, that's it, and they move on. They assume that the 1.3 million other websites are just reaffirming what they know.
Then they encounter the car where the job, it's the same mechanical skills, same using of a wrench and a screwdriver, but they encounter the job where the skills are the same, but the superficial window dressing is different, and they feel like they can't do it. Right. So that's what we end up finding when we look for transfer, is that if you have the explicit cues of the things that are going to be the same, the deep structures, you seem to be able to be better at going from car A to car B versus I only know how to do it on this car. Right? No, if you know that, if you have the skills to do the job on the car, you have the skills to do it on another car, you just don't know it. Right? So
again, just recognizing those cues, just recognizing what you, and it's the natural, recognizing the information that you have available to you.
One of the things that does seem to aid the distance of transfer, so near transfer versus far transfer. So near transfer being something that is very superficially similar versus far transfer something that is superficially very different. Right? So I give you a car and then I give you a tank. It's like, no, the stuff's the same. It's the same principles. Right? But it's a car and a tank, man. Like, what do I do? So what seems to aid far transfer, right? So car to tank is if I explicitly, when I'm teaching you, tell you this is the underlying thing. When you see a bolt, this is what's happening, right? That seems to improve it. So as you're talking about being able to identify the cues, so sometimes it helps if somebody tells you what the cues are, and then you can say, I pull on this lever now, right? So I think that's a good place to at least attempt to wrap this up and say that preparation for future learning as a paradigm seems to apply well in this information-rich age, and that what we're really looking for in preparation for future learning is the ability to identify learning or increased speed or quality of learning in a knowledge-rich environment. So we want to try to maybe optimize for the skill set of identifying stuff in that knowledge-rich environment and then improving. So preparation for future learning doesn't necessarily look for accuracy in problem solving, it looks for signs of problem solving. The longer you've worked on how to solve problems, the more likely you are to be that expert novice, the more likely you are to solve novel problems over time, because it does take time. So what my aim with this is simply to say we should probably be trying to develop our skills as individuals to identify information, to vet information, especially when it's something that we don't know much about. Don't necessarily rely on the supposed authority, rely on your ability to identify stuff and vet information. And preparation for future learning might provide you the impetus to develop the skill set to operate in that novel environment where you actually don't know much. So really, I think what I'm trying to drill at, and I don't know if you agree with this, but really get better at identifying that you don't know much about something and vetting information. So I need a bigger memory card. But so that you have the final word, what did you...
Oh, I was just saying, I agree. I definitely agree, and I just think, being an expert novice, being good at new things and approaching new situations with the awareness to gain that information that's around you.
But we do still need experts.
Experts.
All right, so we need both. But improve your skill at being an expert novice.